Hey, it's Steve. This is the first in a series of a few videos as I work on building this year's donation layout. Every year during the month of April, my son's school has a silent auction, and once again this year I'll be building a small layout to donate to that silent auction to help raise money for the school. This year the layout will be a 20 by 36 inch On30 layout, just a simple loop of track with a trolley, a street scene in the front with a couple structures, some vehicles and whatnot. The back will be a hillside with a tunnel through it, but for the most part a pretty simple, straightforward layout. Now I am using 2 of the Woodland Scenics built-in ready structures because I only have about a month to complete this layout, and so I just simply don't have time to build structures from kits or from scratch. And so to help speed things along, I am using 2 of these built-up structures. And for the base of the layout, I'll be using a 20 by 36 inch pine panel that I picked up from Lowe's. I'm also using 1/2 inch thick 1x3s for the frame of the layout, some 1x3s on the bottom to help stabilize the layout, and then a larger 6-inch wide piece of pine for the back to help with the back of where the tunnel and hillside will be. And so to start off, I took some 1x3, sawed it to length to basically use as pleats on either side of the panel. The main point here is that because this panel is made from a bunch of pieces of pine plank, I do want to have it stabilized so we don't see any warping over time from humidity changes and that kind of thing. So by having these 1x3s on each end and then one in the middle, that will really help to stabilize the whole structure and keep it from warping, especially when I'm doing scenery work and there's liquids involved, with glues and things that might penetrate the wood. And then for all the edges, I'm basically using 1/2 inch thick 1x3 pieces of wood. And so for all the edges of the layout, I basically glued and used some finish nails to attach the 1x3s all around to make a nice perimeter frame for the layout. I do have the interior recessed about 1 inch from the top of the side panels to help basically kind of contain all the scenery and to help provide some protection for the layout. So when you're moving it around, you're not going to damage the scenery on the edges as easily as well. Now again, for the back of the layout, I'm using another piece of pine. It's a 6-inch wide strip of pine, and that I'm gluing and also attaching some screws. I'll put a few more screws on here in a minute, but for now it's basically just glued and clamped. I did add a cleat and a couple screws to help keep it more or less secured in place while the glue dries. Now for the front part of the tunnel area and the front part of the hillside, I'm going to have a retaining wall. The back of that retaining wall is going to be a 1x3 inch strip of pine once again. And since it's a little trickier to screw up from the bottom, I just went ahead and used my pocket hole jig and drilled some holes in there so I could screw the board down from the top into the base. Now the screws that I used to attach that piece of pine did stick out through the bottom, and so I did take my Dremel and just kind of quickly cut those off. I also took another piece of my 6-inch pine and cut some side pieces so the tunnel area would have some side walls as well as a back wall to it to help again secure that whole part of the layout. Okay, so once I had those side pieces tacked in, I went ahead and used a drill bit that has a countersink on it, and so I went ahead and drilled some holes and screwed in the back panel as well as the side panel from the inside into the baseboard to help really secure that in place really strongly and provide a nice stable structure here again for the back part of the layout and the scenery, because I really want to make sure the scenery is really well secure in the back and very stable. We're not going to have anything shifting around and moving when the layout is being transported or banged around a little bit. So once everything was secured together, it was time to go ahead and give everything a good sanding. So to do that, I used my orbital sander, first with a medium grit and then a fine grit sandpaper until everything was nice and smooth, and I had rounded over the edges a bit as well. I'm not actually going to go ahead and apply a finish to the sides of the layout until I get some of the initial scenery work done. Basically, I want to get all the plaster work and everything else done first before I go ahead and actually do any of the staining and finishing on the sides of the layout. Now, since this is an On30 layout, I can use HO scale flex track. I could have used the On30 track that actually has kind of like the scale size ties that look a little bit better, but because I am going to have half a track buried in the street and the other half, basically inside the tunnel, there's really not going to be much exposed track that you're actually going to see. And so I just went ahead and used some Code 100 HO scale track that I had on hand. I decided to secure the track directly to the layout base instead of using a layer of foam or cork, because I wanted to make sure that everything was nice and secure with the very tight radius curves that I have on this layout. And so by nailing it directly to the wood, I can make sure that there wasn't going to be any shifting when I was trying to do the installation and end up with, kinked rail joints and that kind of thing. Now this layout will take about 2 1/3 pieces of the flex track, which are each about 3 feet long, to complete the basic loop. But with the sharp 7-inch radius curves, I wanted to make sure I went ahead and soldered 2 of the pieces together before actually attaching them to the layout. In this way, I would have a nice secure rail joint, and it would also help to avoid that rail joint developing a kink over time. To further help prevent the joint from developing a kink, I put it in the middle of the straight section at the rear of the layout. I nailed the track to the base using pretty much every nail hole that was available in the flex track, and still trying to make sure I had some nice smooth flowing curves on either end. Normally I would glue the track in place and then use the nails just temporarily and then pull the nails out afterwards. But again, in this case, I'll have the track buried in plaster and in the tunnel, and so for the most part, I'll probably leave most of the nails here in place anyway, since they're not going to be visible. So once I had the first 2 pieces of track installed, I took the streetcar I planned to use on the layout and pushed it around to make sure all the clearances were fine, and then temporarily power the track to make sure the streetcar would actually negotiate the tight curves without any issues. I've actually previously used this streetcar on curves as tight as 3 inches before, so I didn't actually expect there to be any trouble with the 7-inch radius curves, but sometimes you end up with a little section that has a little bit tighter curve or whatever, or maybe the track is a little bit out of gauge, so I wanted to make sure that the track wasn't going to cause any issues for operation on this little layout. And with everything looking good so far, I went ahead and took my Dremel tool, cut off the longer pieces of rail that were sticking out from the first 2 pieces of track, and then took my other piece of flex track, measured it up to the needed size, and cut that to size. I did have to remove a nail from the track on the right-hand side to make it a little bit easier to attach that last piece of flex track. So once I had everything in place and in alignment, I went ahead and nailed everything in place in the front, and also added nails to the extra holes that I hadn't nailed yet on the sides of the layout and the curves. And so once that track was in place, I again tried to test the streetcar on the full loop of track before soldering the joints. With the streetcar still running fine on the loop of track, I went ahead and soldered the rail joints in the front, and then I went ahead and drilled some holes for the feeder wires along the side of a pair of the rail joints and soldered those feeder wires in place. Finally, I placed the 2 structures I planned to use on the layout to make sure everything fit the way I wanted. And so here you can get a rough idea of what things will generally look like when everything is done, with the streetcar running through the street scene on the front of the layout, and then through a tunnel under a hillside on the back side of the layout. So anyway, that's all for part 1 of this series. In the next video, I'll work on getting the rough scenery put in place, including the tunnel in the back and building up the street and sidewalks on the front of the layout. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the remainder of this series or the upcoming series that I have planned here in the coming months as well. So that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.